All right, welcome to the Axiom of the Infinite Unknown, episode 8. I am Ciaran the Quarrelsome O Regan, and I am joined by
James, the rational meme, Valaitis.
Nice. So basically, what we're going to discuss in today is something that I was looking to chat about for the last few weeks, but I was kind of off the grid for a while, doing a lot of writing stuff, and I really, when me and James were chatting last week or the week before last, I was like, how about let's just talk about the open society, basically, and this whole idea of open versus closed society and the difference, because there's that meme, we might have discussed it before, this bit of a parable about did we do this in a previous podcast, the parable of the old fish swimming in the ocean.
Oh, and what is water? That
Yeah. So basically, in short, old fish swimming in the ocean meets these two young fish. The old fish is having a great day, really enjoying itself. The conditions are lovely. The young fish meets the two young fish and says, "What's the story, lads? The water's lovely today, isn't it?" And then the young fish look at each other. One of them looks back at the old lad and says, "What is water?" And I think that's what's going on in a lot of this in culture at the moment, is there's people here in the Western world that don't realize that the only reason that we're even able to have open discussions around things like racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, any of those things, the only reason we even get to have those discussions is because we don't live in a closed society. We live in an open society that is grounded in Enlightenment liberalism, with basically science, reason, and freedom as core values that allow for an open environment for ideas to be exchanged. It's a minority. We're the luckiest people that have ever lived ever. Basically, of the luckiest 1% of people, a fraction of a percent that have ever lived ever in what we have available to us in terms of our freedom to read whatever book we want, to talk about whatever we want, without fear of even. I'm here in Catholic Ireland, where 50 years ago, if I had some kind of a discussion like this, I could get kicked out of my community, get excommunicated from the community. There's that Catholic oppression, where there was women and babies getting brought off to homes, and babies getting thrown into mass graves. Just even down the road, there's a mother and baby home, 900 babies in fucking holes. Like, this is recent. Like, this is only in the last few decades. Magdalene laundries, boys getting taken away and raped and sexually abused in these industrial schools. So, and no one could talk about it, no one could question it. And this is only a few decades ago. So we're coming out. We're still in this process of reaping the fruits of something that kicked off hundreds of years ago, probably with the Protestant Reformation, that helped to create that bit of space between society and dogmatic thinking that couldn't be questioned, and then that potentially facilitated the Enlightenment itself, which then basically led to the conditions in which we sit now in open society in the Western world, which isn't Saudi Arabia, and it's not China, and it's not North Korea, and they're not countries that are. We have the ability to question our leaders and to question anyone in society without getting black bagged in the middle of the night by secret police or burnt at stakes, basically. So the big reason I wanted to talk about this is because I see there's a lot of people who don't realize, they don't appreciate the conditions in which they're swimming, and there's not an awareness of perspective. So with all that, that's the kind of the intro. And one example of this I'll give as an example from this whole Black Lives Matter, kind of the rhetoric that's surrounding this Black Lives Matter movement, is one example of this kind of dogmatic thinking that I see, is this kind of circular argument, which is that's used by people to shut down discussion, which is white silence is violence, which relates to this thing that they call complicity, which is that unless you're actively anti-racist, you are then racist. So if you're not actively anti-racist, that makes you a racist. So then you either become actively anti-racist and your silence makes you a racist. But then also, if you do speak in dissent, so white silence is violence unless you speak in dissent. And then if you speak in dissent, that means you have white fragility because you're defending your position as a white person at the top of this power hierarchy that they're basically viewing the Western world through, as this basically this identity politics viewing of the world as if the primary means to do so is identity groups based on different interlocking characteristics. And that is despicable. That's this despicable, closed, dogmatic thinking. That is, it just shuts down. That kind of idea is the very kind of thinking that wouldn't have allowed a discussion on race to happen 100 years ago or 150 years ago. You know, that it wasn't, that wouldn't have, like these people, like David Fuller, we used a quote just before we hit recorded from David Fuller, and Rebel Wisdom had this line that these people are sawing off the very branch on which they sit, that they're introducing tools, they're introducing weapons more so than tools into the zeitgeist that are antithetical to the very ideas that allowed them to get the freedom to even have a civil rights movement in the first place. So they're basically using closed society tools against the open society that even allowed them to have a civil rights movement. That which I'll hand it over to James now, because he has a brilliant discussion on a few points on rational versus irrational memes. But one example would be two examples that we've talked about multiple times on this show. One, female women's rights activists tortured in jail in Saudi Arabia for wanting to drive cars. That's an example of a closed society, and that's what an actual patriarchy looks like. Second one, the second one is China. On average, like I won't even go into the stats, but basically, civil rights activists going missing every day, just disappeared, black bagged. 1.5 million Uyghur Muslims. We're going to talk about this, if not at the end of this podcast, but in the next one, we'll go down the rabbit hole on China again, because of some horrible stuff that's going on there. That's another example of a closed society that's getting increasingly closed as a result of different pressures. But anyone who campaigns on behalf of these Uyghur Muslims, they're in trouble, basically. You can't speak out. Same things are happening with Hong Kong and everything, but they're examples of closed societies, whereas we're happy to be an open one. But I went on a bit longer than expected there, but I'll hand the reins over to...
Nothing new there, man.
Yeah.
But no, that was beautiful. It was beautiful.
I had some venting to do, man.
Yeah, no, good. Me too. No, it was beautifully said, and you set it up perfectly, because, as you said, there is an environment, a culture in which we live that allows for the exploration of these new ideas, or perhaps not even always new, but contrarian, heterodox viewpoints. And how is it that we find ourselves fortunate enough to be in the age of progress? Because Homo sapiens have lived for, well, we've had the categorization of Homo sapien for 200,000 years, is the sort of range that we give it. And why is it that we haven't just progressed at the speed of recent progression since the very beginning? Why did we live so long just in the same manner for literally tens of thousands of years? Slow enough that, and this is the categorization of a static society. Static society is one in which progress happens slow enough that in no one person's lifetime is there a discernible difference from the day at which that person is conscious of their life and the day they die. And at that pace, then you can have fluctuations in how the culture tends to behave, because no one person can discern the way in which it's changed. So that's a static society. It's not perfectly static, but it's static enough such that you would die having died in the same world you felt you'd always lived in since you were very first aware of the world. And so with that idea of what a static society is, it's important to understand how is it that a static society continues to just almost not be so unlucky that it doesn't get progress, but actually be resistant, immune to progress. It is immune to the ability to get better in measurable ways, like human lifespan and nourishment and all of these things that we care about and take for granted now. We take for granted them to the degree that actually now we have far more of an issue of obesity than we do poverty or starvation. Well, poverty is obesity now. That is the world in which we live. So how did we get here? Well, static societies function on irrational means. A meme, hopefully, I'm not going to give a full setup to a meme, but a meme is, you know, as devised as I'm aware of by Richard Dawkins, is the sort of, you have genetic evolution and you have mimetic evolution. Mimetic evolution is that which occurs in the realm of culture and ideas and beliefs and these sorts of things. And it happens at far faster rate, but it's far more fragile. Obviously, if a meme isn't transmitted from one generation to the other, it's lost because there is no hard coding. Whereas if a gene isn't expressed in a few generations, it will still be there when it's time to be expressed. Like if the environment changes such that that gene needs to be expressed again in the new generation. So they're susceptible to that. But as I said, they happen far quicker. They happen at the pace of me telling you the meme, you processing the meme, internalizing the meme, your brain deciding whether that meme is good or bad, your own instantiation of that meme in your brain, and then your enacting of the meme such that it's transmitted to somebody else. That can happen in a day, you know, easily. And if you have that going on every day, you can see how they evolve very quickly, because the important part is the transmission is not perfect. Like in genes, the way in which we evolve is based on imperfection. It's based on the mutations that happen in genes from the parent to the child. And that happened over millennia. Then you have, the transition from the Tiktaalik that was just getting out of the water onto land, and then us. Like, that's how you go from there, is imperfection. Memes are just inherently imperfect in the way they're transmitted because they rely on my ability to say words to you such that you understand the words and hopefully something close to what I actually meant by the words. They then go through your brain and you then recreate the information for yourself, because being able to recite a passage from the Bible isn't the same as coming up with the same knowledge that was written down in the Bible, because it's only that through that process that you actually can claim to know something. You don't know it if I've told you a phrase in German and you've got no idea what it means, but you can recite it perfectly to somebody else. You don't know that phrase. You just know how to copy it, parrot it. But the actual transmission of a meme requires that you recreate it in your head from the information I give you. And so in that imperfection, you may make it even better. And in making it better, it depends now, we're talking about what are you making it better for. Irrational memes become better in static societies for suppression of creativity. How is it we create new knowledge? It's by the process of conjecture, the ability to be creative, explore new ideas, and in coming up with a new explanation, comparing it to the old explanation and seeing if it works better. A good explanation is that which cannot be easily varied, that can't just be replaced by an equally sort of inane explanation and there's no difference in the outcome. So if that is the process of creativity, and irrational memes are necessarily not created, but their purpose is to suppress creativity, we can now get a sense of how it is that a society doesn't progress when it's running on irrational memes. Irrational memes are those where the host benefits the more the meme stops them from conjecturing. Why though? Because if they start to be creative, they will be at best shunned from their community and at worst killed by the authoritarian government, if they're lucky enough to have a government, or just the leader of the tribe, or any one of these things, or the other members of the community. And so it is of benefit to the host, the better the software running on their brain, and therefore the memes running in their brain, stop them from conjecturing, and therefore stop them from making progress. I've already talked for so long, and I haven't even got onto dynamic societies. But so maybe
can I give an example of a one of these?
Yeah, that'd be good. And now I can set up
and then go dynamic.
Yeah.
An example of a dynamic of a static society with irrational memes. And this will lead into the open society, closed society thing. So an example would be, imagine which would have been the case for potentially hundreds or thousands of years, is monarchic societies that would have had some kind of religious affiliation with the leadership, like the pharaoh or whatever. You know, pharaoh in Egypt, or look at the kings throughout European history, where there's a religious weight added to give them validation for their power. And in that kind of society, for someone to go underneath that, to go, fuck it, you know what, I don't know if I buy this whole religion thing, and I don't know if I like this fella with the crown on his head telling me what to do, and I don't buy the religion thing, and let's say, or even if I do buy the religion thing, how the fuck can this fella have validation from a king when I know he gets up to funny business with people, let's say sexual stuff or whatever? He gets up to weird shit. I know, I've heard whispers, but I can't. But then if I was to stick my head above the parapet and offer some kind of point of critique and say, how about we actually just as a group, we get little pebbles, and then people who want to be leaders put themselves forward, and we put pebbles in their buckets, and then we get to decide who the leader is ourselves. Off with my head. Gone. You know, because I'm questioning it, because I'm not buying into this basically this meme that prevents me from coming up with new ideas about how a leadership structure could work, because it's locked in with there's the actual physical force that could be imposed upon me by the community, or some kind of a military kind of thing controlled by the monarch, plus there's this extra, let's say, religious weight added to it because of some validation from some religious authority on top of it, of that this king is God's representative as the leader or whatever. Then that's locked in. Because it's locked in, anyone that offers a dissenting point and puts their head above the parapet is like, you're like James had said, burnt at the stake kind of a job. So there's an example of a irrational meme that succeeds, because that people succeed if they abide by the meme, which is to allow yourself to buy into the fact that, okay, fine, I buy the religion thing, I buy the king thing, he's selected, fine, just keep my head below the parapet, don't offer any questions, just if this fella decides to up the taxes, then whatever, again, I'll just play by the rules, and then I'll stay by that, because if you put your head above the parapet, you're done. So I think does that function as an example of
yeah, it does. And exactly as you say, we have to remember how these memes actually manifest themselves. They manifest themselves exactly as the current pharaoh in this example is ordained by God, and they are they are empowered by a higher dimension, that if you were to even try questioning it with your puny brain, then you're questioning God itself, and that can't be abided.
And think about it in terms of like Inquisition stuff. Like it actually functions for someone to act as if they're a genuine believer in the whole religion thing and monarch thing, and then to use this dogmatic, the more dogmatic you are, the higher you can rise up this hierarchy of power, because you're actually sticking closer and closer to the meme itself.
That's
So that
exactly
allows you
it.
to become a
Yeah.
pope or a bishop or whatever.
That beautifully explicates the reason why the evolution of even irrational memes is important, because the better they get at keeping you in favor with the rest of the community, the higher up the host can get in the community.
Yeah.
And the better that host will do, the more children it will have, and the more the meme will be spread. And so the memes evolve in an irrational community to be better, but to be better at suppressing creativity
Yeah.
and being dogmatic.
And
So
suppressing heterodox thinking,
exactly.
suppressing diversity of opinion, suppressing open discussion.
Exactly. And so in exact opposition to that, you have dynamic societies with rational memes. And so the transition between the two is incredibly imperfect, so messy, so as to not be able to actually distinguish what is a perfectly dynamic society and what is a perfectly static society. Is England a perfectly dynamic society? No. We still have all of these vestiges of our static society, our irrational memes that still function in the minds of people. But we have transitioned such that we have made enormous progress in the Western world. So what is a dynamic society? A dynamic society is exactly that, is one in which the society, from the age at which a person's finally made aware of the world, maybe it's about 5 years old and they're finally getting a feel for what the world is like around them, to the day they die, is a very different world in which to live. And so that's a dynamic society. And it's not hard to say that since we were born, like I remember the internet being talked about and being like, oh, what, like you stick this wire in your laptop and now we can. And I remember from then to the introduction of smartphones, that we don't even need to go into all of the ways in which our world has just changed so at a rapid rate. So that's a dynamic society, and those are the fruits of a dynamic society. What's a rational meme? A rational meme
And
is one.
social innovations. Until 1994, it was illegal to be gay in Ireland.
Yes, that's really important as well.
And then the
Right in
changes
all of this.
increase at an exponential rate. So it's just going,
Yep.
and it's just like,
No, exactly. It's inevitable. It's so inevitably in the sort of evolution. I'll use it in a different sense now. In the evolution of a dynamic society, you inevitably get to the point at which actually you stumble upon human rights, because you can't be a dynamic society with notions of what it is to have human liberty and not stumble upon the fact that, oh, right, keeping slaves doesn't really accord with the human liberty thing. You inevitably get to the point that you will say, oh, right, we've got to actually abide by these things that we've said for 100 years, 200 years, but we haven't actually lived to fruition. So a rational meme is one that when it gets better, when it evolves, it gets better at being more truthful. Because in a dynamic society, what does a host benefit in a dynamic society? The host benefits from running on better truths. The more in line you are with reality in a dynamic society, the more software that you've got running in your brain that better guides you through the infinite ignorance. The closer to truth you can be, the better you're going to get on. And so the memes actually evolve because the more truthful the meme is, the better it does for the host. And then you can see how that cascades, such that through conjecture, through creativity, you get closer and closer to the truth. And why is the truth so good? Because it has universal reach. What in a static society might be good for one person at one time in one particular context, but for other people it doesn't work at all. In a dynamic society, the memes that are created are close to the truth, and therefore they're useful for everybody that runs them. With that universal reach, that is what allows the creation of good explanations, and these good explanations are why it is that you see China pick up and go, you know, these free like in the 1980s, all free markets, maybe we'll try them. And the universal reach, the good explanation of free markets as to how they play within human psychology and competition and self-interest and all of this, and the decentralized nature of knowledge, like it, guess what? It works in China like it works in England, like it works in America, like it works anywhere, because it has universal reach. So as soon as China started running those memes, they've exploded in one sector of their country. So with this truth and with imperfect replication, where we go through that process and I tell you the meme, Ciaran, and then, or rather you see me enacting the meme, and then you figure it out in your head and you start enacting yourself and you do it slightly differently. But if you do it differently and you do it better than me, now it's evolved to be even better meme, because maybe you go, oh, like I thought he did this, and now your, you know, and now your way of what's a good example now? I suppose your manner in which you say, I'm a software developer, so let's say pretend you were doing software development as well, and your manner in which you architected the app, or for, I guess, the layman, in which you architect a house because you went through architect school and you did it all in university and you did your doctorate and everything, and now you're an architect, but you do it slightly differently. If your houses are better, then people are going to start copying you, and maybe their house will be a bit better from how they've sort of tweaked the formula. So that's the way in which things evolve in a dynamic society. You get closer to truth, you make progress, and everything expands from there. And so that's why it is that you can go tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years without making any progress. And then all of a sudden, it seems like we've gone from 0 to infinity in the space of 400 years. And you need an explanation as to why. And then this is the explanation. So I suppose now would be a good time to go on to say, okay, so that's the process by which a static society can create knowledge, and a dynamic society can create what we would understand to be knowledge. That seems like two different knowledge, like these are two different products from two different systems. How do we refer to this? And that's where I think you come in with your sort of your brilliant dichotomy, the distinction you make between the two. So I'll let you sort of explain that.
Perfect, man. Yeah, and so basically, there's a couple of words. So I've been grappling a lot. One of the things I've been writing about, so of late, trying to grapple with is essentially, there was a feel to it where I was like, no, there's different types of knowledge here going on. So like there's that example of that circular argument kind of thing that I talked about earlier on, and the reason that kind of thing emerges, that kind of white silence is violence to white fragility kind of circular argument that you can't get out of. The reason that kind of thing emerges is because it comes off the back of an irrational meme. So the irrational meme is based along the lines of, as a starting point of essentially kind of, you could think of it as like a revealed truth, religious fundamentalist dogma, which is essentially Western civilization is broken, it's inherently racist, there's this white cis male hetero patriarchal oppressive nature built into it from the beginning. Hence, it needs to be burnt down and then rebuild something new, utopia from the ashes. So this is this starting point that comes from this postmodern, neo-Marxist critical theory, or what could be called critical social justice ideology. That's the starting point. So because they have a starting point like that, which is an irrational meme, like you described, then off the back of that, a set of knowledge is generated that is unquestionable, because it's starting from a place of arrogance. So it's starting from a place of epistemic arrogance, which is to say, what we know is more important than what we don't know. This is truth, and now afterwards we have truths, and now we're just going to defend it. That's the same, which is this Western civilization is broken kind of fundamentalist ideology way of viewing the Western world. And then because they start with what they think is some kind of essentially a revealed truth that they accept as genuine truth, unchangeable in light of any future evidence, the knowledge that's generated from that kind of idea, from that kind of irrational meme, is unquestionable. So they set it up so that they actually set it up so that it's unquestionable. That's where that kind of argument is okay to people who think like that. Because that kind of argument is okay, because it doesn't matter if it has a circular nature or if you can't use logic or reason to have discourse with it, because to them, logic or reason is irrelevant because they already know what truth is. So they're not trying to learn, they're only trying to defend the belief.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of knowledge that you're not allowed to question, I call dogmata, which is it's a body of knowledge that is that you're not allowed to question it for fear of being labeled or treated as a blasphemy, as a heretic, or as treated as if it's blasphemy against some higher authority or higher order or revealed truth. The other type would be something like, so that's a body of knowledge or knowledge itself that you're unwilling to let go in light of any future evidence, dogmata. The second type of knowledge then is where it might very well be held strongly, but it's held strongly with the mentality of, I can never know if this is true, and I'm willing to let it go if the evidence is good enough. So an example of, so that I call that enigmata, because enigma, A-E-N-I-G-M-A, is the old Greek word for riddle. So, because the thing about an enigmata is that we can never know if it's true because of the axiom of the infinite unknown. Because the name of this podcast is it's just the axiom of the infinite unknown, just in a very short, describes the epistemic or the knowledge-based relationship between a single human and all knowledge that has ever existed in the universe in the past or will ever exist in the future. So because a single person can never have all knowledge that has ever existed or will ever exist, and can never even know if they have all knowledge and there isn't just other knowledge they don't know about, then they can never be certain about anything other than the need to remain uncertain. So enigmata is knowledge that you hold as if it is transient truth because you can never know if it is actually true. Yeah. And therefore you're willing to let it go in light of evidence. And what enigmata is generated off is it comes from a place of epistemic humility, which is epistemic arrogance is I put the knowledge I do have on a higher pedestal of importance than the knowledge I don't have. Epistemic humility is I put the knowledge I do have on a lower pedestal of importance than that which I don't. So I'm always putting a higher level of importance on the knowledge I don't have with enigmata, or with, that's what creates epistemic humility, because it comes from a place of perpetual uncertainty. Uncertainty is the only certainty. That we're seekers of truth, we're not guardians of belief. People who hold dogmata about anything are guardians of belief. People that hold enigmata are seekers of truth because they know they'll never find it.
Yeah, and I think an important distinction to be made in listening to you now, I can imagine a person for which this runs a little bit too close to a sort of nihilism, a complete fatalistic abandonment of the idea of solid objective truth. The point is, there is an objective truth.
Yeah,
there is truth to be sought out. It's just a realistic recognition that we will always be navigating our ignorance. Yeah. Because the amount we know, even in, say we continue this trajectory for another million years, we've been on this trajectory for like 500 years. So this trajectory for a million years. Okay, so what can you even imagine we'd know? Just so much. We'd still know less than 0.00001% of everything there is to know. And so you're always going to be navigating your ignorance.
Yeah.
The point is not to give up. The point is to just recognize that ignorance navigation is crucial to making progress. And so the better you can get at doing that, the more progress can be made, the better the lives of the people navigating the ignorance.
Yeah.
And so we want to come up with better ways of navigating that ignorance. And the worst way is to just decide that you even know everything already.
Yeah.
And then you'll be walking into the dark assuming that there isn't a hole because you know there's not a hole, and you'll fall into the hole and die. Or you'll walk straight into the lamppost. There is no lamppost, straight into the wall. The lamppost would have been illuminating it. But nevertheless, you want to know the ways in which you can navigate that ignorance rationally. And that's what we're speaking to, is when you have that axiom of the infinite unknown, with that's empowering. It's not disempowering.
Yeah. Precisely, it's empowering, and it's what modern science is based on. That's why science works. So I think, and this way of thinking to me or you is not novel by any means, of course, because we've talked about this so much, and we've read a lot of similar books and everything, but the reason science works is because the body of knowledge that's generated by the method of investigation. So science is simultaneously, the word is used to describe a body of knowledge. So someone might say, does science on this shows? But science is also a method of investigation. And in very simple terms, without going into technical language, the way that the method of investigate, the way that science works as a method of investigation is, to use Popperian language, like Karl Popper's language, it's generate a conjecture, and a conjecture is just an idea formed with incomplete knowledge, and we always only ever have incomplete knowledge. And then if it's a good explanation, so if it's worth actually testing, then you give it a belt of a sledgehammer, which he would call a refutation. You attempt to refute it. Whereas another way of putting it, like Carl Sagan put it wonderfully poetically, where he said, along the lines of, science is a balance of wonder and skepticism, where you have to have enough wonder to allow yourself to bring new ideas in and play with them. And then, but you can't go down this route, because all of a sudden then you could end up drifting off down into tarot cards and healing crystals and shit. Whereas if you have too much skepticism, then you end up not allowing enough new ideas in to allow them to be played with. And so then you don't generate novelty. You don't generate novel, useful ideas. So it's a balance. You have enough wonder to let new ideas in, and then enough skepticism to give those new ideas belts of sledgehammers, because this is why science works, basically, largely, is because it's that balance of the two, and because it's, as a result, with inbuilt systematic skeptical machinery, it allows us to find out where we're wrong rather than where we're right. And that's the inverse way of looking at knowledge generation. So a lot of this critical social justice kind of, the stuff that's like woke social justice warrior culture, they're not trying to find out where they're wrong. They're just trying to pile up evidence to confirm where they're right. That's why James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Pluckrose could get Mein Kampf published or accepted with just feminist buzzwords swapped in. It's why they could come up with a paper claiming to have investigated the genitalia of 10,000 dogs in Portland dog parks and doing jumping jacks next to dogs that were humping to scare them off. And they got it. Not only did it get published with a top feminist geography journal, but it also won an award because it fit the narrative. So they're not the ideology that generates these ideas of this critical social justice body of knowledge that's fueling the momentum of this Black Lives Matter thing and a lot of this other stuff. And it's fueling the kind of memes that are in the minds of the people, that are fueling the kind of generation of the knowledge that are in the minds of people that are attacking J.K. Rowling, that are going after, Maria Navratilova, the tennis player for basic.
Yeah, Maria, yeah.
Yeah, so this is because they're not trying to find out where they're wrong. Science is about coming up with an idea, find out where you're wrong, not where you're right. And then if you haven't been able to find out that your idea is wrong, then you're like, all right, nice one. It's right for now until future evidence emerges. So an example of that would be the only reason that the GPS on my Google Maps works is because Einstein presented the theory of general relativity in 1915 to the Prussian Academy of Sciences, and then that happened to be able to do what Newton's celestial mechanics could do, plus some extra shit. And then as a result, we now know they were able to figure out that time moves differently in space, so that now they can adjust the GPS, so that, or if they didn't adjust the GPS or the clocks on the GPS satellites, or my GPS on my phone would be wrong 11 kilometers per day. Yeah. Because time moves differently in space. We only know that as a result of Einstein's GR.
That's a really good example, actually, of this. That speak to the nihilism before. Like, if we're constantly replacing what we knew with what we now know, then when we were never there and we would never be there. So what's the point? Well, the point is that Newton's mechanics worked really well, and allowed for a hell of a lot of progress, which otherwise wouldn't have been allowed for.
Yeah,
its replacement by Einstein's general relativity wasn't a complete. I'm going to use the word refutation, but in a sort of stronger sense of, wasn't a complete refutation or destruction of everything that Newton had put in place. It was more like that was a good explanation. Newton's explanation was great. It was really good. Yeah. But now we've got a better one. And it does everything, as you said, everything that his one did and more. So that now we have GPS. So it was a good explanation that gave us so much. Its replacement by an even better explanation doesn't mean that we shouldn't have ever bothered with it, because if we hadn't bothered with it, we wouldn't have made all of the progress necessary to get to the point where we could come up with a better explanation. Yeah. So this is by means of saying, like, that the recognition that everything we know now might be wrong doesn't mean that everything we know now is useless.
No. Yeah, it's just less wrong than previous times we were wrong. So we're just less wrong. That's really important. Yeah.
But being less wrong is really important. It's a difference between living to 80 or living to 40 and just expecting that to be your run. Like, it's really important.
But as you said, it's really empowering. But an example is along the same lines of celestial mechanics. An example of a static society that was very... so just like I mentioned, I use the example of the sticking your head above the parapet to question the idea of the king and the religious stuff. An example of that, let's say I was only chatting to an Italian philosophy lecturer friend of mine yesterday. I just happened to bump into her outside a coffee shop. And we were talking about the Enlightenment and she mentioned a really interesting character that I'd forgotten about, which is your man Giordano Bruno, who basically posited some ideas around the workings of the solar system that ended up, I think he was either burnt or hung as a result, but they were really useful ideas. I think it might have been around the heliocentric model, maybe. I can't remember precisely, but it was along those lines of...
He was an Italian, wasn't he?
Yeah.
That's why I guess you're Italian, because he was an Italian philosopher. Yeah. Your Italian philosopher friend happened to bring up Giordano Bruno. Yeah. Pretty perfect. Yeah, no, 16th century guy.
Yeah. Was it celestial mechanic? Was it
Copernican model? Yeah.
So in that scenario, so what you ended up with there was a bottom-up generation of a conjecture that bounced off a top-down, rigid, closed society authoritarianism from the Catholic Church. And what that resulted in was a reaction from the Catholic Church that ended up with your man getting either burnt or hung or whatever. And and so in that, maybe even worse. So in those scenarios, like, so that's one example. But what Newton basically, so I suppose two things I think might be worth highlighting. So the transition in that allowed Europe, the Western world, Western Europe, to go from a closed, static society to a semi-closed, increasingly dynamic society was this transition that's known as the Age of Enlightenment.
Yeah.
That kind of facilitated that. There was still monarchs and there was still a massive influence of Catholicism and everything and all this and religion, but that was kicked off initially, I think, from my understanding, a good way of viewing it to be kicked off was the Protestant Revolution, Protestant Reformation.
Yeah,
That
Luther.
created, Luther. So then that created a gap. It created enough space between societies and religious authoritarianism for the Catholic Church. It created enough space for there to be a bit of breathing room to all of a sudden start having whispers and start to generate conjectures. That created a bit of space. And then you ended up with thinkers like Francis Bacon, who started bringing in elements of skepticism and other guys. And then eventually the Scottish Enlightenment lads like Hume, and you had the French Enlightenment's a different thing. But regardless, the British Enlightenment is the one that David Deutsch prioritizes when he's writing.
Yeah, he calls it the beginning of one of the beginnings of infinity.
Yeah, because it basically, it resulted in, at large, this removal of the idea of a top-down purveyor of truth, and instead a bottom-up individual's ability to seek truth. And that's what it is, like a fundamental shift. That it wasn't immediately perfect, and of course there was still the religious, like as I said, Ireland is in the Western world, but until 50 years ago we still lived in a largely dogmatic and Catholically oppressed society. But so that's the Enlightenment. But part of what went with that was this space that was created, then helped to create space elsewhere that then facilitated the generation of democratic societies.
Yeah.
And a lot of this was said with stuff like the Glorious Revolution in England, that Magna Carta, rule of law, and then that facilitated the ability for things like the Parliament and the House of Lords. And then you end up look with a document like in the US,
the birth of a nation. It has, as I've said before, it has universal reach, because for as much as it's completely opposed to the culture as it currently stands, it only needs to be opened up in one arena, and then it starts competing, and it usually outcompetes because it's so useful. There's only so much you can ignore science until such a point as you have to keep reintegrating it into your static dogma. Like the Catholic Church keeps having to give ground. Like notice the Church has never ceded, science has never ceded ground to religion. It's never gone that way. Religion got it right, we got it wrong. It's only ever in one direction.
Individual scientists did, because their heads were on the chopping block otherwise. But science as large, as a body of knowledge, didn't.
Yeah, and so Catholicism embraces evolution. All of this happens. Like, they embrace birth control. This happens because they end up having to cede the ground, because it will only ever happen in one way, because truth will outcompete it. But the transition is messy, and the tension in the transition is incredibly fraught. And it's what you see in China now. It's what you see in cultures, nations like Ireland during the Troubles. It's always going to be a messy transition.
Yeah,
and that's not to say that they aren't two distinct things, and also that one is better than the other.
Yeah. And that's it. And an example would be with one of the things that I think is worth highlighting is that the reason that something like a democracy is worth defending, in terms of imperfect though it is, the reason it's worth defending is because it's the least shit option we have. And not just democracy, but science. And science and democracy work. Science is the purest form of it, which is this acceptance that we're always wrong, but we're trying to get less wrong. And we're trying to correct our errors. Science is based on systematic error correction, on the assumption that we'll always be ignorant. Democracy is systematic error correction on the assumption that malevolent or incompetent people need to be gotten rid of before they cause too much hassle. It's not about putting the perfect people. It's not about seeking the perfect leader, the perfect president, the perfect prime minister. That's naive. That's Platonic stuff. The That's like Plato's who should rule kind
Yeah,
of idea.
exactly,
It's not
yeah.
about that. Democracy is built with systematic, inbuilt assumptions that all rulers have the potential to be Stalins.
Yeah, we
That's what
need
it's
to.
built off.
So I'm aware of the fact that you said you needed to leave like five
Yeah.
minutes ago. So I think we need to pick up there
Right.
because that error correction is the crucial next component, and from there we can feed into China. Because
Perfect.
as you were saying, we're not looking for the perfect leader. We're looking for the system that allows identification of a bad leader and the removal.
Yeah.
The error correction is what's important there. So
Yeah.
we'll pick up there next time, yeah, dude?
Perfect, man. That was a tremendous conversation.